When Michael Torres signed the foreclosure papers on the abandoned grain silo complex for $350, the county assessor looked at him like he'd just purchased his own grave. The structures hadn't stored wheat in 22 years, their metal walls rusted through in places, their conveyor systems frozen into monuments of agricultural collapse. The land around them stretched flat and empty under an unforgiving Nebraska sky, 5 acres of cracked earth where nothing had grown since the drought of 2001. But Michael wasn't buying potential. He was buying a roof for himself and his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, because their landlord had sold their rental house to developers and Michael's construction job had evaporated when the highway project got canceled. Sometimes desperation looks like opportunity if you squint hard enough through the dust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Michael stood in the gravel lot of the grain silo on a scorching July afternoon, his pickup's engine ticking as it cooled under the relentless sun. Emma pressed against his side despite the heat, both of them staring at the structure that would become their home. 3 massive silos rose before them like rusted cathedrals, each 180 feet tall and 30 feet wide, their cylindrical forms connected by a labyrinth of metal walkways and conveyor chutes. A 4th, smaller silo stood apart, its purpose unclear from the outside. Faded lettering still marked the main structure's base, Whitmore Grain Storage, established 1889. The name meant nothing to Michael. Just another piece of discarded history in a county that specialized in forgetting. Emma's small hand tightened around his. "It looks scary, Dad." Michael couldn't argue. Even from outside, the complex carried the weight of abandonment. Not just empty, but forsaken. The kind of place people drove past without seeing, their minds editing it out of the landscape like it had already ceased to exist. Wind moaned through gaps in the metal walls, creating sounds that were almost human. Almost mourning. That made it perfect. No one else would want it, which meant no one would compete for it, which meant Michael could actually afford it. The math was brutal but simple. $350 for the silos versus $900 a month for the house they'd lost. The grain storage had walls and mostly intact roofs. That made it paradise compared to the alternative, which was sleeping in his truck at rest stops while trying to keep Emma hidden from child services. "Old doesn't mean bad," Michael said, forcing confidence into his voice. "It just means it's been standing a long time. These silos survived 100 years of Nebraska weather. That means they're solid. We can make this work." Emma looked up at him with eyes that carried too much understanding for 8 years old. She'd developed that look over the past 14 months, since her mother Sarah had died from complications during what should have been routine surgery. Sudden, clinical, final. No dramatic goodbyes. Just Michael holding Emma in a hospital waiting room while trying to figure out how to be both parents at once. The county assessor had given Michael a single key, heavy brass worn smooth by countless hands over more than a century. It felt like an anchor in his palm as he approached the main access door, a thick steel barrier designed to keep grain secure and moisture out. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a metallic groan that echoed through the hollow spaces beyond. The interior hit them like stepping into an oven. Heat that had built up over 22 summers with no ventilation, thick enough to choke on. Dust motes danced in shafts of light filtering through cracks in the metal walls. And beneath it all, a smell of old grain and machine oil, of rust and forgotten industry. What sunlight penetrated the gloom revealed a vast open space at the base of the main silo, concrete floors cracked but mostly intact, metal stairs spiraling up the interior walls toward platforms and catwalks that disappeared into shadows above. "Can we really live here?" Emma asked quietly, her voice small in that cavernous space. Michael surveyed their new home with what he hoped resembled optimism. The silos themselves were too cylindrical, too vertical to live in comfortably. But attached to the main structure was a 2-story control building, its windows intact, its rooms visible through an open doorway. That's where the silo operators had once worked, managing the flow of grain, coordinating with the railroad that had once run through here. Those rooms could be cleaned, made livable. "We'll take it step by step," Michael said. "See that building there? That's where the workers used to have their offices. We'll pick the best room, clean it out real good. Set up our beds. I can get the electricity working, rig up some cooling. It'll be like camping, but permanent. I don't want permanent camping, Emma said softly. The words struck Michael harder than his daughter probably intended. Emma used to embrace adventure. Before Sarah died, before Michael's steady work dried up, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Emma had been fearless. She'd explored construction sites with Michael, built elaborate structures from scrap wood, invented games that could occupy her for hours. Now she flinched at change, clung to routine, looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Michael knelt to his daughter's level, his knees protesting against the gritty concrete. I know things have been hard. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can evict us. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable. Emma studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. You promise? Michael had learned the weight that promises to children carried. Promises you might not be able to keep. I promise we'll try our hardest. That's all I've got. Emma seemed to accept this, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Michael tested light switches, finding to his relief that some electricity still functioned, though several circuits had clearly failed. The plumbing proved more complicated. Water flowed when he turned a rusted faucet in what had been the facility's washroom, but it ran brown for several long minutes before clearing to something approaching normal. The toilets functioned, which Michael counted as a significant victory given his low expectations. The control building revealed operator stations with ancient computer terminals, a break room with a refrigerator that had become a biological experiment, and storage areas packed with boxes of old paperwork and equipment manuals. Michael made mental notes of what could be salvaged. Some cleaning supplies, basic tools, even a few folding chairs that might work once wiped down. A metal filing cabinet in one corner, its drawers rusted shut. As the sun began its descent toward the flat Nebraska horizon, Michael started hauling their possessions from the truck. An office with railroad schedules still tacked to the walls. A storage room full of old grain sample bags. A break room with a calendar frozen on September 1999. Michael was making notes on the ventilation system, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Emma's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. Dad. Dad, come quick. Michael was up those stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering. Emma's tone hadn't been panicked exactly, but something close. He found his daughter standing at the far end of the second-floor hallway, in front of what appeared to be a solid concrete wall. What's wrong? Michael asked, scanning for danger. Nothing's wrong, Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. But look at this. She pressed her hand against what appeared to be solid wall, and a section of concrete facing swung inward with a soft mechanical click, revealing a heavy steel door beneath. A door Michael would have sworn wasn't there moments before. It's a hidden door, Emma whispered. I was leaning against the wall and felt something move under the paint. Michael approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. The false concrete panel was cleverly designed to seem like solid wall when closed, operated by a hidden switch disguised as an electrical conduit box. Beyond the steel door, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple utility closet. Stay here, Michael instructed Emma. He pulled out his phone, activating its flashlight function, and pulled the steel door open fully. Cool air rushed out, impossibly cool given the building's overall temperature. The room beyond was roughly 12 feet square, and as Michael's phone light swept across the space, he understood why it maintained such low temperature. He was looking at a preservation chamber, climate-controlled and still functioning after 22 years of building abandonment. Industrial insulation lined the walls. The air felt dry and carefully maintained. And stacked along one wall were metal containers, document cases of some kind, sealed and labeled with dates from the 1940s. But what commanded Michael's attention was the opposite wall, where a large photograph hung in a protective frame, somehow preserved despite the decades. The image showed a man in his 60s, dressed in the formal style of the early 20th century. He stood beside a locomotive, one hand resting on a railroad spike, his expression stern and uncompromising. Beneath the photograph, a brass plate bore an inscription. Michael had to step closer to read it clearly. Theodore Whitmore, 1855 to 1937. Built the rails. Fed the nation. Trusted no one. What is it? Emma called from the doorway, unable to contain her curiosity. It's a hidden chamber, Michael said slowly. I think it belonged to the man who built this place. Emma slipped past him despite his earlier instruction to stay put, her eyes huge as she took in the preserved room. Why would someone hide a room? It was an excellent question. Michael had no answer. He moved to the metal containers, examining them more closely. They weren't just document storage. The cases were too heavy, too deliberately sealed. He pried open the nearest one, the seal breaking with a soft hiss after decades of preservation. Inside, wrapped in oil-treated cloth that had survived the years in perfect condition, were neat stacks of bearer bonds. Old ones, dated from the 1920s and 30s, issued by railroad companies Michael had never heard of. And beneath those, something that made Michael's hands tremble, gold certificates, genuine ones from before the gold standard ended. And below those, actual gold coins. Morgan silver dollars, double eagles, rare denominations that collectors would pay premiums for. Michael counted quickly. 40 coins in this case alone. And there were at least 10 more cases stacked against the wall. His hands trembled as he opened another case. More bonds. More certificates. More gold. A third case. More still. Daddy, Emma whispered, her breath visible in the climate-controlled air. Is that real money? Michael stared at the precious metals and historical financial instruments gleaming dully in his phone's light. Real money. Probably hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. Maybe more. Hidden in a preservation chamber in an abandoned grain storage facility he'd purchased for $350. Yes, Daniel heard himself say from very far away. I think it is. Michael spent the next 6 hours locked in that climate-controlled chamber while Emma sat outside, entertaining herself with her sketchbook. The cool air bit through Michael's shirt, numbed his fingers, made his breath fog in the carefully maintained atmosphere, but he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what Theodore Whitmore had left behind. The chamber contained more than money. Tucked behind the metal cases, Michael found a leather journal, its pages stiff but remarkably preserved by the controlled environment. He carried it out to warmer air, waiting for it to reach room temperature before opening it, afraid the brittle paper might crack if handled too quickly. While he waited, Michael counted. 10 cases total, each containing a mixture of bearer bonds, gold certificates, and actual gold coins. At current precious metal prices, even accounting for the need to sell discreetly, he was looking at somewhere north of $400,000. Maybe closer to $500 if the bonds were still valid and the certificates could be redeemed through collectors. It was more money than Michael had earned in the last decade combined. Enough to give Emma everything Sarah's death had stolen from her. A real home, good schools, college savings, security against every disaster that might come. Everything a father could want for his daughter. But the journal, when it finally warmed enough to read, complicated everything. The first page contained a single line written in precise, old-fashioned script, "For whoever finds this, having purchased what my blood abandoned, you've earned the right to know what they never deserved to know." Michael's hands trembled as he turned to the next page, where detailed entries began. Not business records, but something more personal. A confession of sorts, written by a man who clearly trusted no one. Theodore Whitmore's entries spanned from 1920 to 1936, documenting not just where he'd hidden wealth, but why. The man had lived through the Panic of 1893 and watched the railroad empires rise and fall. He'd seen neighbors lose everything to banks they'd trusted, watched fortunes evaporate overnight in the crash of 1929. So he'd created his own security, systematically converting portions of his profits into bearer instruments and precious metals, hiding them where his children couldn't squander them. The journal described not one chamber, but 3 separate locations across the property. Wealth divided and hidden with the careful paranoia of a man who'd seen empires crumble. But it was the final entry, dated 3 weeks before Theodore's death in 1937, that made Michael's chest tighten. My sons believe this grain storage is their birthright, earned through blood rather than character. Neither understands what built this operation. Neither respects the farmers who trusted me with their harvest or the workers who labored to process it. They see only profit, not purpose. I have made arrangements. Let the land judge who is worthy. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever purchases what my sons will surely abandon, may they prove worthier than my blood. Michael read those words 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness. A father disinheriting his sons not through legal channels, but through concealment. Theodore had left the grain storage to his children in his will, but the wealth that actually mattered, he'd hidden with instructions only discoverable by someone who occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The sons had clearly sold everything eventually. The paperwork Michael had found suggested the complex had operated sporadically through the 1950s before closing permanently in 1999. 60 years of the Whitmore family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what really mattered. And now that inheritance belonged to Michael Torres, a 36-year-old construction worker who'd bought the property because he'd run out of options, not because he deserved anything. Michael emerged from his research to find Emma had drawn an elaborate picture of the hidden door, complete with mysterious shadows and question marks. The girl looked up as her father appeared, her expression curious but patient. "Did you find treasure?" Emma asked. "Maybe," Michael said. "I found some very old information. I need to check a few things to know if it means anything. Can I help?" Michael considered this. He'd need to locate the other 2 chambers Theodore had mentioned. Some of that work Emma could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while he pursued what might be an elaborate dead man's fantasy appealed to him. "Yeah," Michael said. "You can help." They drove into Millbrook, the nearest town of any size, with the journal locked in Michael's glove compartment. The town consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had seen better days. A hardware store, a diner, a farm supply shop, a bar called the Grain Belt that probably served as the town's social center. Michael parked outside the hardware store, a place called Henderson's that looked like it had been there since Theodore Whitmore's time. The interior smelled of fertilizer, metal, and motor oil. An older man stood behind the counter, his weathered face and calloused hands marking him as someone who'd done more than just sell supplies over his lifetime. "Help you find something?" the man asked. Michael had prepared a mental list. Shovels, a heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, and bolt cutters in case any of the other chambers had rusted locks. "Need some excavation supplies. Couple shovels, good flashlight, and heavy bolt cutters." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You the fellow who bought the old Whitmore place?" News traveled fast in small towns. Michael shouldn't have been surprised. "That's me. Michael Torres." "Frank Henderson," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "My grandfather worked at that grain storage back in the 20s and 30s. Said it was hard work but honest pay. Theodore Whitmore ran a tight operation. Paid fairly, treated his workers with respect, even if he worked them hard." Michael felt a strange connection to the stern face in that photograph. What happened to the operation? Why'd it close? Frank's expression soured. "Theodore's sons, that's what happened. James and Robert Whitmore. Both inherited ambition without skill, entitlement without vision. They spent 40 years running that storage into the ground. Refused to modernize, treated farmers like they should be grateful for the privilege of doing business with them. By the time Robert's son took over in the 80s, there wasn't much left to salvage. Place limped along part-time until the late 90s, then just died. The story aligned with what Michael had read in Theodore's journal. A legacy destroyed by entitled heirs who'd never understood what built it. Well, Michael said, I'm hoping to make something of the property. Maybe convert it to workshops or storage. Starting with cleanup. Frank studied him with an assessing gaze. What exactly are you planning to excavate? Michael had anticipated this question. Previous owners left a lot of junk on the property. Old equipment, scrap metal buried in various places. Figured I'd dig it up, sell what I can for scrap. Clean the place up properly. Frank nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. Bolt cutters are on that wall. Got professional grade ones, run you about 130. Shovels and flashlights over here. The total came to $248, leaving Michael with almost nothing. As Frank rang up the purchase, he said casually, you know, there's been stories about that grain storage for years. Folks say old Theodore hid money all over the property before he died. Urban legend type stuff, but the stories persist. Michael kept his expression neutral. People say that about a lot of old places. Usually, Frank agreed, but Theodore Whitmore wasn't like most people. Man survived 2 financial collapses by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth. Michael loaded his purchases into his truck, hyper-aware of the journal in his glove compartment. If rumors about hidden wealth already existed, he'd need to be extremely careful. The last thing he needed was treasure hunters or opportunistic locals taking interest in his activities. Back at the grain storage, Michael spread Theodore's hand-drawn maps across a workbench in one of the offices, comparing them to the current property layout. The second chamber was supposedly located beneath what the journal called the loading platform. Michael had noticed a concrete pad at the property's southern edge, probably the foundation of some demolished structure. The map indicated the chamber was buried 6 feet due east of the pad's southeast corner, at a depth of 5 feet, if the measurements were accurate, and if the chamber hadn't been disturbed. Michael was looking at major excavation work. He and Emma walked the property as the afternoon heat pressed down like a weight. The southern pad sat in an area now overgrown with prairie grass and thistle. Michael marked the spot the measurements indicated, then started digging. The Nebraska soil was hard, baked by decades of sun and drought. Michael worked steadily, sweat soaking through his shirt, blisters forming despite the gloves. Emma helped by clearing away the dirt he excavated, piling it neatly to one side. 4 hours of digging brought them to a depth of 4 feet. Michael's back screamed, his shoulders ached, and doubt had begun creeping in. Maybe Theodore's map was deliberately misleading. Maybe the chamber had been discovered years ago. Maybe this whole thing was an elaborate fantasy of a paranoid old man. Then his shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty property. Michael dropped to his knees in the hole, using his gloved hands to brush away soil from what his shovel had hit. Metal emerged, pitted with rust but intact. Another chamber door, smaller than the climate-controlled one, but similar in construction. Heavy steel, industrial-grade lock. Is that another treasure room? Emma called from above, leaning over the edge of the hole. Michael applied the bolt cutters to the rusted lock. It resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack. He pulled the chamber door open. Inside, wrapped in the same oil-treated cloth, were more bearer bonds and gold certificates. Not as many as the first chamber, maybe 60 instruments total, but also something else, stacks of old currency, carefully preserved, and what appeared to be stock certificates from railroad companies that no longer existed. At current values, even discounting the questionable worth of century-old stocks and currency, he was looking at another $150,000 minimum. Emma stared at the contents with huge eyes. "Daddy, we're rich." Rich. The word felt foreign. Impossible. 48 hours ago, Michael had been counting change to buy gas. Now he was looking at potentially $600,000 in hidden wealth, with one more chamber still to locate. "We need to be very careful," Michael said, his voice sounding strange. "We can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Michael researched inheritance law and property rights on his phone. The legal situation seemed clear enough. He'd purchased the property through legitimate foreclosure. Assets found on the property belonged to him. Theodore Whitmore's heirs had owned the land for decades and sold it off without discovering what lay beneath. Their loss, legally speaking. But Michael kept coming back to Theodore's final entry. The bitterness of a father disappointed in his sons, the deliberate construction of a system that would only reward someone who actually occupied and worked the property. His phone rang, startling him in the quiet office. Unknown number, local area code. Michael answered cautiously. Michael Torres. Mr. Torres, a man's voice, professional and clipped. My name is David Whitmore. I understand you recently purchased the Whitmore grain storage property. Michael's stomach dropped. Whitmore. A descendant, calling him the same day he'd found the second chamber. That couldn't be coincidence. That's right, Michael said carefully. Can I help you with something? I'd like to meet with you, David said. Discuss the property, its history. I'm Theodore Whitmore's great-grandson. My family has some interest in the site's historical preservation. Historical preservation, code for searching for Theodore's rumored hidden wealth. Most likely, Frank Henderson's casual mention of the legends suddenly seemed less innocent. I'm not looking to sell, Michael said. I'm not looking to buy, David countered smoothly. Just to talk. I'm in town tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the property. Say 10 in the morning? Michael wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Theodore's great-grandson knew, what he wanted. And maybe, despite everything, he wanted to look him in the eye and decide for himself whether he deserved to know about the wealth his ancestor had deliberately hidden from his family. 10 works, Michael agreed. After the call ended, Michael sat in the dark office, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing and the old building's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he wasn't prepared for, a confrontation between blood inheritance and discovered fortune, between what was legal and what might be right. He thought about Theodore's photograph hanging in that climate-controlled chamber, that stern, uncompromising expression. What would the old man say if he could see his great-grandson coming to claim what he'd specifically denied his lineage? David Whitmore arrived exactly at 10, driving a silver sedan that looked aggressively out of place against the grain storage's industrial decay. He emerged dressed in what Michael recognized as expensive casual wear, the kind of clothing designed to look effortless while probably costing more than Michael's monthly grocery budget. Mid-40s, Michael guessed, with graying hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Emma watched from the second-floor window as Michael descended to meet their visitor. He'd told his daughter to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as David approached with measured stride. Mr. Torres, he said, extending a hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet. His handshake was firm, professional. Michael noted he wore a wedding band, and his eyes were already scanning the grain storage's exterior with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Mr. Whitmore, Michael replied. You said you wanted to discuss the property's history. David, please. He turned his full attention to Michael, and Michael recognized the expression. Assessment. He was trying to determine what kind of person he was dealing with, how much he might know, what leverage he might have. My great-grandfather built this complex. It's been connected to my family for over a century, even if we no longer own it. Your family sold it, Michael pointed out. Multiple times from what I understand. It went through at least 5 different owners before the county foreclosed. David's jaw tightened slightly. My uncle and father made decisions I didn't agree with. They saw the grain storage as a burden, a failing business. They never understood what Theodore built here. Michael gestured toward the building. And what did Theodore build here, exactly? David turned to study the silos, his expression shifting to something that might have been genuine nostalgia. An empire, for a time. Theodore Whitmore came to Nebraska with nothing in 1878. By 1900, he controlled grain storage and distribution across 3 counties. He employed over 100 men at the operation's peak, paid them fairly, treated them with dignity in an industry known for exploiting workers. My great-grandfather believed in building something that would last, a legacy for his family. But it didn't last, Michael said. No. David's voice carried bitter acknowledgement. My grandfather James inherited ambition without skill. My great-uncle Robert had arrogance without vision. They spent 40 years dismantling what Theodore built. My own father finished the job. He turned back to Michael. Which brings me to why I'm here. There are family stories about Theodore. Things he may have left behind that weren't part of the official estate. There it was. Michael kept his expression neutral. What kind of things? David studied him carefully before responding. Theodore didn't trust banks. The financial panics reinforced that distrust. Family legend suggests he may have kept assets hidden on the property. Insurance against economic collapse. My father dismissed these stories as fantasy, but I've done research. I've found references in old letters, cryptic mentions in documents. I believe the stories are true. And you want to search my property for your great-grandfather's hidden treasure, Michael said flatly. I want to recover assets that rightfully belong to Theodore's bloodline, David corrected. You purchased the buildings and land, Mr. Torres. No one disputes that. But if there are family assets hidden here, those weren't part of the sale. They remain family property. That's not how property law works, Michael said. I bought the land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally. Legally, perhaps, David conceded, but morally, these are my family's assets, hidden by my great-grandfather for his descendants. The fact that my grandfather and father were too incompetent to find them doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that Theodore apparently hid them specifically so his sons wouldn't find them, Michael asked quietly. Does that change the fundamental ownership? David's eyes widened. What do you know about that? Michael realized his mistake too late. He'd revealed knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to someone who'd only owned the property for 3 days. But backing down now would only make things worse. I found Theodore's hidden chamber, Michael said. And I found his journal. I know exactly what he thought of his sons and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, David simply stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, without much humor. So you actually found it. The chamber everyone whispered about but no one could locate. How? My daughter has a talent for finding things, Michael said. David's expression shifted, calculation replacing surprise. Then you know where everything is located. You know what's buried here. I know what might be here, Michael corrected. It was a lie, but necessary. David didn't need to know about the gold coins currently secured in the climate-controlled chamber. Mr. Torres. Michael. His tone became more conciliatory. I understand this puts you in a difficult position. You purchased this property legally, but I'm asking you to consider the ethical dimensions. Theodore was my family. His wealth was built through generations of work. Does the fact that you happen to buy this complex give you moral right to everything he accumulated? Does the fact that you share his blood give you moral right to wealth he specifically hid from his descendants? Michael countered. David flinched. You read what he wrote about my grandfather? I did. James was a difficult man, wasn't he? James was cruel, David said quietly. Entitled, dismissive of others, sometimes violent. Everything Theodore wrote was probably true. But that doesn't define our entire family. I barely knew James. He died when I was 10. I'm not asking for this inheritance because I deserve it through some divine right of blood. I'm asking because I've spent my adult life trying to understand Theodore, trying to honor what he built in ways my grandfather and father never did. What does that mean? Michael asked. David pulled out his phone, scrolling through images before handing it to Michael. The photos showed historical documents, research materials, academic papers. I'm a history professor, Mr. Torres. I specialize in agricultural development in the Great Plains. I've written extensively about the grain storage industry's evolution. Theodore's story is part of that history, and I've been documenting it for 15 years. Michael scrolled through the images. Articles bearing David's name, photographs of Theodore at various stages of his life, copies of operational records from the grain storage. The research was extensive, genuine. So you want the money to fund more research? Michael asked. I want the money because I'm 44 years old, teaching at a state college for poverty wages, and living in a rental house I can barely afford, David said bluntly. I want it because I'm Theodore's great-grandson and I'm struggling while his wealth sits hidden on properties sold off by people who never appreciated what they had. I want it because yes, it would change my life. And unlike my grandfather and father, I would actually do something meaningful with it. The raw honesty surprised Michael. He'd expected legal threats or emotional manipulation, not this direct acknowledgement of personal desperation. It was something he could relate to intimately. Two men standing on opposite sides of an inheritance neither had expected, both struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I need time to think about this, Michael said finally. David nodded slowly. How much time? I don't know. A few days at least. And in the meantime, you'll what? Excavate what you can and then decide how much to share. Michael met his gaze steadily. In the meantime, I'll read more of Theodore's journal, understand what he wanted, and try to figure out the right thing to do. Which is more consideration than your family gave this place for 60 years. David absorbed this quietly. That's fair, he said eventually. More than fair, actually. He pulled a business card from his wallet, handing it to Michael. That's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. He paused. And Michael, thank you for not just telling me to leave. After David departed, Michael stood in the grain storage lot, turning the business card over in his hands. Dr. David Whitmore, Associate Professor of History. A scholar struggling to survive in academia's brutal economy, researching the legacy his own family had abandoned. Emma emerged from the building, having apparently watched the entire conversation from her window perch. Was that man mad? She asked. Not mad, Michael said. Frustrated. Maybe hurt. Is he going to take our treasure? Our treasure. Emma had already claimed ownership with the simple, absolute logic of childhood. Michael crouched to his daughter's level. It's complicated, sweetheart. That man is related to the person who hid the treasure. He thinks it belongs to his family. But we found it, Emma said with perfect 8-year-old reasoning. And we bought the place where it was hiding. That makes it ours. Michael wished adult morality were that straightforward. Sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. I need to figure out which matters more. That night, after Emma was asleep, Michael lay awake on the hard floor, his mind churning through impossible choices. Theodore had written that the land should judge who was worthy. But the land judged nothing. It simply existed, bearing witness to human drama, offering its secrets to whoever happened to be present when they revealed themselves. Michael hadn't earned this discovery through virtue or dedication. He'd stumbled into it through desperation and his daughter's curiosity. Did that make him worthy by Theodore's standards? Or did David's 15 years of research and documented struggle qualify him instead? Or maybe, Michael thought as sleep finally pulled him under, maybe worthiness wasn't something you inherited or earned. Maybe it was something you built, one honest choice at a time. Michael spent the next 4 days excavating the remaining chamber while Emma attended a summer program at Millbrook Elementary. Working alone in the brutal Nebraska heat, Michael followed Theodore's maps to a location beneath what had been the railroad loading dock. The area was now completely overgrown, the tracks themselves torn up decades ago, leaving only the concrete foundation and rusted bolt holes where rails had once been anchored. The map indicated the chamber was buried 8 feet southwest of a specific marker, a cornerstone Theodore had installed himself, engraved with the year 1889. Michael found it half buried in the soil, weathered but intact. He measured carefully, marked the spot, then started digging. The work was backbreaking. 3 days of excavation, blisters on top of blisters, muscles screaming. But on the 4th day, at a depth of 6 feet, his shovel struck metal. This chamber was different. Larger, more elaborate, clearly Theodore's primary hiding place. Inside, Michael found the bulk of the fortune. More bearer bonds than he could count quickly, gold certificates stacked in careful rows, and nearly 200 gold coins of various denominations. Also, something unexpected, a second journal, this one containing detailed instructions for liquidating the assets, contacts for discreet dealers, legal considerations for claiming old financial instruments. Theodore hadn't just hidden wealth. He'd created a complete system for recovering it, assuming whoever found it would need guidance navigating the complex process of turning century-old assets into usable currency. By Michael's careful estimate, looking at current market values and the redemption potential of the bonds, he was looking at close to $700,000 total across all 3 chambers. More than enough to transform both his and David's lives completely. He sat in the hole he'd dug, surrounded by Theodore's carefully preserved legacy, and thought about the bitter old man who'd trusted no one enough to simply leave them an inheritance. Who'd instead created this elaborate test, this treasure hunt for worthiness that had taken 87 years to complete. On the 5th evening, Michael called David. "I want to meet again," he said. "Tomorrow if you're available." "Same place, 2 o'clock, David said, his voice tight with anticipation. "I'll be there." Michael arrived early, standing in the grain storage lot as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. David appeared precisely at 2, parking his sedan and approaching with an expression that tried to mask desperation with professional composure. "Thank you for calling," he said. Michael had rehearsed this conversation 100 different ways. Direct honesty still seemed like the only approach that felt right. "I found all 3 chambers," he said. The contents matched Theodore's descriptions. Everything he said he hid is there. David's breath caught. "And?" Michael pulled out his phone, showing him photographs he'd taken of each chamber's contents. "Your great-grandfather accumulated serious wealth. More than I initially realized." David studied the images, his hand trembling as he scrolled. "How much?" "I estimate close to $700,000 in total value. Maybe more, depending on how the bonds redeem." "My God," David whispered. Michael set his phone down. Theodore wrote that he wanted the land to decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. So I'm deciding. He paused, making sure he had David's full attention. "I'm keeping half." David looked up sharply. "Half?" "Half," Michael confirmed. "I purchased this property legally. I found these chambers through my own work and my daughter's discovery. I need this money to give Emma a stable life, opportunities she won't have otherwise. That's worth something." "And the other half?" David asked carefully. "Goes to you. Not because you're entitled to it through blood, but because you're the only member of Theodore's family who actually cared about what he built. You've spent 15 years documenting his legacy while everyone else forgot he existed. That's worth something too." David sat very still, processing this. "You're serious? We split it completely down the middle? You use your half however you want. I'll do the same. No legal fights, no arguments about who deserves more. Just a clean split between 2 people who both need help and both have reasonable claims." "That's extremely generous," David said quietly. "It's pragmatic," Michael corrected. "Fighting over this in court would cost both of us money and time neither of us can spare. This way, we both get enough to make real differences in our lives." David studied him for a long moment. "You could have kept everything. I have no proof the chambers exist. No legal standing to demand anything. You could have told me you found nothing, and I'd have no way to challenge it." "I could have," Michael agreed. "But then I'd be exactly the kind of person Theodore was bitter about. Someone taking what they didn't earn, claiming what they don't deserve. I don't want to be that person." And I don't want Emma growing up thinking that's acceptable. David's eyes filled with unexpected emotion. My great-grandfather would have respected you. Maybe, Michael said. Or maybe he'd be furious I'm sharing with his bloodline at all. But I like to think he'd understand that sometimes the right answer is more complicated than absolute judgment allows. They worked out the logistics over the next 3 weeks. Michael carefully documented each chamber's contents, photographing and inventorying everything. David brought in a discreet appraiser he'd worked with on historical projects, someone who could value the items without asking uncomfortable questions about their origin. The gold coins totaled $462,000 at current market prices. The bearer bonds, after authentication, added another $185,000 to the total. The gold certificates and old currency contributed another $53,000 through collector sales. $700,000. Split evenly. $350,000 each. Michael opened his first substantial bank account in years, depositing his share in careful increments that wouldn't trigger suspicious activity reports. David did the same, his hands shaking as he completed paperwork that would end years of financial precarity. They met one final time at the grain storage, both of them standing in the climate-controlled chamber where Theodore's photograph still hung. David studied his great-grandfather's stern face with an expression Michael couldn't quite read. I've seen this photograph in copies a dozen times, he said. But seeing it in person, in the room he designed to preserve it, that's different. You could take it, Michael offered. The photograph belongs with family. David shook his head. No. It belongs here, in the chamber he built. This is his real legacy, not the money. This secret room, these careful plans, this whole elaborate system he designed to outlast his disappointment. The photograph should stay where he put it. Michael understood. Some things had value beyond ownership. 6 months later, Michael stood in the grain storage's main silo, watching contractors install climate control and structural reinforcements throughout the complex. The space was being converted into something Theodore probably never imagined but might have appreciated. Mixed-use development. Affordable warehouse space on the ground floor for small agricultural businesses and craftspeople. Workshop areas for metalworking, equipment repair, traditional crafts. Living apartments on the upper levels of the control building, including the office Michael and Emma still occupied, now properly renovated with real walls and actual furniture. Emma attended a good school now, driven there each morning in a reliable vehicle Michael had purchased with cash. The girl had made friends, joined the art club, started drawing pictures that included people smiling instead of just buildings and machines. The change in her was remarkable, as if financial stability had lifted a weight she'd been carrying without complaint. David visited occasionally, combining trips to research Theodore's papers with informal friendship that had developed between them. He'd accepted a tenure-track position at a university in Iowa, using his share of the inheritance to fund a comprehensive book about Theodore Whitmore and the grain storage pioneers who'd built Nebraska's agricultural infrastructure. A real book with a university press that would cement his academic reputation. You know what I keep thinking about? David said during one visit, standing with Michael on the renovated ground floor. Theodore spent his whole life building something permanent, and his sons destroyed it in one generation. But then you came along, and you're building again. Different vision, different purpose, but the same fundamental drive, creating something that will outlast you. Michael looked around at the workshop spaces filling with equipment and supplies. A welder had leased one section, a furniture restorer another. A woman who made custom agricultural equipment occupied a third. All of them were people trying to build small businesses, create something lasting. I don't think I'm that ambitious, Michael said. I just wanted stability for Emma. That's exactly what Theodore wanted, David said. Stability for his family, a legacy that would last. You're more similar than you realize. Maybe he was right. Michael had never thought of himself as a builder of legacies, just a father trying to survive. But standing here, watching people transform the space Theodore had created into something new yet connected to its past, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose beyond mere survival. That evening, after David had departed and Emma was working on homework, Michael returned to the climate-controlled chamber one final time. He'd left it largely unchanged despite the renovations, preserving it as a kind of monument to the man whose paranoia had accidentally saved Michael's life. He looked up at Theodore's photograph, meeting those painted eyes that seemed to assess him across decades. "I hope I did right by you," Michael said quietly. "I kept half, shared half, tried to build something instead of just taking. Best I could figure." The photograph offered no response, but Michael hadn't expected one. "Let the land judge," Theodore had written. And Michael understood now what that meant. Buildings rose and fell. Fortunes appeared and vanished. People came and went. But the land remained, bearing witness to all of it, judging none of it, simply existing as the stage where human drama played out. Michael had stumbled onto that stage by accident, desperate and broke and running out of options. He'd found treasure he hadn't sought and faced moral questions he'd never expected. And in the end, he'd tried to honor both his own needs and a dead man's complicated legacy. Whether that made him worthy by Theodore's standards, Michael would never know. But standing in that climate-controlled chamber, thinking of his daughters sleeping peacefully in their renovated home, Michael thought maybe worthiness wasn't something you earned through grand gestures. Maybe it was something you built slowly, one honest choice at a time. The grain storage hummed around him with new life. Somewhere in the walls, the building's history lived on, all those decades of work and abandonment and rediscovery compressed into steel and concrete. Michael was just the latest chapter in a story that had begun long before him and would continue long after. But for now, this chapter was his and Emma's. And in some way, it was also Theodore's. The old man's final plan coming to fruition in ways he could never have predicted. 3 years moved across the grain storage property like seasons, each leaving its mark in ways both visible and profound. The complex that had once stood as a monument to abandonment now thrived with purposeful activity 6 days a week. The workshop spaces Michael had created hosted 11 small businesses now, their combined energy transforming the massive structure into something Theodore Whitmore might have recognized despite the changed purpose. Not grain processing anymore, but craft and creation. The fundamental work of building things that would outlast their makers. Emma turned 11 in the spring of the 3rd year, growing confident in ways that sometimes caught Michael off guard. She'd become something of a local legend, the girl who discovered a climate-controlled vault and changed her family's fortune. The story had spread despite Michael's attempts at discretion, transformed through adolescent retelling into something more dramatic than reality. Emma handled the attention with surprising grace, neither denying nor embellishing, simply existing as herself. She'd developed a passion for architecture, spending hours designing improvements to the grain storage's systems or sketching theoretical structures that could enhance agricultural communities. Michael kept her drawings in a folder in the climate-controlled chamber, which remained preserved exactly as they'd found it, Theodore's photographs still watching over the small space with that stern expression. David visited quarterly now, his life transformed by the financial stability Theodore's inheritance had provided. He'd published his book about Nebraska's grain storage barons to critical acclaim, parlaying that success into a full professorship. But he made time to return to Millbrook, to walk the grain storage property and document its evolution for what he called a companion study about legacy and reinvention. "You've created something remarkable here," he said during his spring visit, surveying the busy workshop floor where a metalworker was teaching basic welding to a group of high school students Michael had agreed to mentor. "This complex is more alive now than it was even in Theodore's time." Michael wasn't sure about that. "It's just people working. Same as it always was." "No," David corrected gently. "It's community. Theodore ran a business. You've built an ecosystem. There's a difference." Maybe there was. Michael had certainly never planned anything so grand. The workshop spaces had started as a way to generate income to cover the grain storage's maintenance costs, but they'd evolved into something more organic. A place where craftspeople supported each other, shared equipment and expertise, created a network of mutual aid that extended beyond the building's walls into Millbrook's broader community. Frank Henderson from the hardware store had become a regular presence, offering advice to younger craftspeople and occasionally teaching classes on traditional techniques his own grandfather had learned. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. Michael had expanded the residential units too, converting more of the control building's upper floor into affordable housing for artists and craftspeople who couldn't manage Millbrook's slowly rising rents. Emma's suggestion, actually, born from watching one of the equipment makers struggle with the commute from 2 towns over. 8 units now, all occupied, all contributing to the building's transformation from industrial relic to living community. The money from Theodore's chambers had made all of it possible. But Michael had been careful not to simply spend the windfall. He'd invested most of it, creating revenue streams that could sustain the grain storage's operations without depleting the principal. His construction background had proven invaluable for the renovation work, allowing him to do much of the labor himself and stretch the budget further than professional contractors could have managed. He still thought about Theodore sometimes, wondered what the old man would make of what his hidden wealth had created. Not the legacy Theodore had probably imagined, but a legacy nonetheless. The Whitmore name lived on in the building's informal title. Everyone called it the Whitmore Workshops now, even though the property legally belonged to Michael Torres. On a mild evening in that 3rd year, Michael stood alone in the climate-controlled chamber where Theodore's photograph hung. He did this sometimes, especially when gratitude needed expressing to someone who couldn't hear it. "Your great-grandson sent me your early business ledgers," Michael said to the stern, painted face. "I read about your first years here. The struggle, the doubt. You wrote that you wanted to build something your children could be proud of, something that would serve the community that supported you." He paused, collecting his thoughts. They didn't get it. But somehow we did. Emma's learning to design buildings that serve people, not just store grain. David's preserving your story for people who'll never meet you. And in this complex you created, it's alive again. Not the way you imagined, but maybe better. Maybe exactly what you hoped for when you wrote about serving communities instead of just yourself. The photograph offered no response, but Michael hadn't expected one. These conversations were for him, a ritual that kept him grounded, reminded him how unlikely this all was, how easily it could have been different. The grain storage made sounds at night, different from those first terrifying evenings. Now they were familiar sounds, metal settling, wind finding harmonious notes through the ventilation, distant voices from the residential units where craftspeople were finishing their day. The sounds of occupation, of life, of purpose. Michael climbed the stairs to their apartment, where Emma was already asleep, her desk covered with architectural sketches and math homework. He stood in her doorway, watching her sleep in their strange home that had somehow become simply home. All the desperate choices, all the unlikely discoveries, all the careful decisions about money and legacy and what constituted doing right, all of it had led to this moment. A sleeping child, safe and secure. A building brought back to life. A community built from abandoned space and hidden wealth. The land will remain, Theodore had written. And Michael understood now in his bones what that meant. People came and went. Fortunes rose and fell. Buildings stood and crumbled. But the land remained, offering its blank slate to each new generation willing to work and build and try. Michael Torres had proven willing. And in Theodore Whitmore's hidden legacy, he'd found not just wealth, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. Not just survival, but the possibility of something that might actually last. The Nebraska night pressed close around the grain storage, vast and star-filled. Inside the Whitmore workshops, people rested, dreaming their own dreams of what they might build tomorrow. And in a climate-controlled chamber at the complex's heart, Theodore Whitmore's photograph watched over the space he'd designed to hide his wealth, the wealth that had accidentally saved Michael Torres and given purpose to everyone who'd found their way to this unlikely place. The complex had been dead. Now it lived. The legacy had been lost. Now it continued. The land had witnessed failure. Now it witnessed resurrection. And somewhere in the spaces between those truths, in the quiet transformation of abandonment into purpose, Theodore Whitmore's complicated dream finally found the inheritors it had been waiting for. Not his blood, but his spirit. Not his sons, but someone who understood that legacy isn't inherited, it's earned through choices made when no one's watching, and the only judge is your own conscience. Michael closed Emma's door quietly and walked to the window, looking out over the property that had saved them. The grain silos rose against the night sky, no longer monuments to industrial death, but testaments to what happens when people care enough to honor the past while building toward the future. The Whitmore name lived on, not through blood inheritance, but through the community that had grown in the shadow of Theodore's hidden wealth. And that, Michael thought, was exactly the kind of legacy that would remain long after the last gold coin was spent and the last story was told. The land remembered everything. And now it had something worth remembering. 10 years slipped past the grain storage like wind through prairie grass, changing everything slowly, the way the land itself changed, patient, inevitable, profound. The complex that Michael Torres had purchased for $350 out of desperation had become something no one could have predicted. Not a museum preserving the past, but a living testament that honored history while creating its own future. Emma turned 18 in the summer of the 10th year, no longer the frightened 8-year-old who'd discovered a hidden chamber, but a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence earned through stability and purpose. She'd graduated high school with honors, accepted a full scholarship to the university's architecture program, but deferred enrollment for a year. Not because she couldn't handle college, but because she wanted time to build something first. "I've been thinking about the smallest silo," Emma said one evening, spreading sketches across the dinner table in their apartment, the apartment that had started as a bare office with sleeping bags on concrete, now a real home with photographs on the walls and a kitchen where Michael cooked actual meals. "It's the only structure we haven't fully utilized. I want to convert it into a community learning center. Small scale, maybe 30 students at a time. Focus on practical skills, carpentry, metalwork, sustainable agriculture, traditional crafts. Skills people can actually use." Michael studied his daughter's detailed plans, recognizing the careful precision that had always defined Emma's approach to the world. "That's ambitious. Also expensive." "I know," Emma said, "but we've got the resources, and more importantly, we've got the expertise. Every craftsperson in the workshops could teach. We could partner with the community college. It wouldn't just be a school, it would be passing on what people here actually know." It was exactly the kind of project Theodore Whitmore would have approved of. Not just creating wealth, but creating capability. Teaching people to build things that would outlast them. "Let's do it," Michael said. They broke ground on the Learning Center in September, and the workshop community rallied around the project in ways that still surprised Michael even after a decade. Craftspeople donated time and materials. Local businesses contributed equipment. The furniture restorer designed a woodworking curriculum. The metalworker, a gruff man named Pete who'd been one of the first to lease workshop space, took personal responsibility for the welding instruction. David visited during the construction phase, documenting the expansion for his second book. He'd become a full professor now, his work on Theodore Whitmore having established him as a leading voice in agricultural history. But he still made time for Millbrook, still walked the grain storage property like someone visiting sacred ground. "You're doing it again," he said, watching Emma direct a team of volunteers installing electrical systems in the silo. "Doing what?" Michael asked. "Building something that will outlast you. Just like Theodore did." Michael had stopped trying to compare himself to Theodore Whitmore. The old man had been a visionary, however flawed. Michael was just someone who'd been desperate enough to see possibility in abandonment and honest enough to share what he'd found. But watching Emma work, seeing the learning center take shape, Michael understood what David meant. Legacy wasn't about blood or inheritance. It was about understanding what mattered and having the courage to build it, knowing you might never see the full result. The Whitmore Learning Center, as they named it, opened in January with 22 students. Young people from Millbrook and surrounding towns who couldn't afford traditional college or didn't want it, who needed practical skills that would let them work with their hands and build actual things. The tuition was minimal, subsidized by the workshop community and what remained of Michael's share of Theodore's fortune. Emma taught the architectural design course herself, despite being only 18. She had a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that made sense, a patience with struggling students that reminded Michael achingly of Sarah. She would have been proud of what their daughter had become. On a mild February evening, Michael stood alone in the climate-controlled chamber where Theodore's photograph still hung. He did this less frequently now, but significant moments still drew him here: the opening of the Learning Center, Emma's high school graduation, the 5th anniversary of splitting the inheritance with David. The vault remained exactly as they'd found it 10 years earlier, preserved as the complex's beating heart. The place where everything had changed. "Your great-great-grandson visited last month," Michael said to the stern, painted face. "David's son, Marcus. He's studying agricultural economics, writing his thesis on rural revitalization. He spent 3 days here, interviewing craftspeople, documenting the community. Your story continues through him too." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Emma's teaching now. Your learning center, though she named it for you, is training kids who need a path forward. David's preserving your legacy in ways that matter. And in this complex you built, it's more alive than it's been in a century. Not the way you imagined, but maybe exactly what you hoped for when you wrote about building communities instead of just fortunes." The photograph offered no response, but Michael hadn't expected one. These conversations had evolved over the years from desperate pleas for guidance to something more like reports to a silent partner, updates on a shared project that spanned generations. In March, Frank Henderson died peacefully in his sleep at 95. The funeral filled Millbrook's small Methodist church, a testament to a life lived with integrity in a community that remembered such things. Michael and Emma attended along with most of the workshop community. During the service, person after person stood to tell stories about Frank's generosity, his willingness to teach, his quiet investments in other people's success. At the reception afterward, Frank's granddaughter approached Michael. "Grandpa wanted you to have this," she said, handing him a worn leather tool belt. It was his grandfather's. The grandfather who worked for Theodore Whitmore. "Grandpa said you'd understand why it matters." Michael held the ancient tool belt, feeling the weight of 4 generations of honest work. "I do. Thank you." That night, he hung the tool belt in the climate-controlled chamber next to Theodore's photograph, a memorial to the workers who'd built the original grain storage, who'd trusted Theodore Whitmore to pay fairly and treat them with dignity. The people whose labor had created the wealth that now funded education for their great-great-grandchildren. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. Spring brought unexpected visitors, a documentary crew from a national network following up on David's published work about the grain storage's transformation. They spent 2 weeks filming, interviewing craftspeople and learning center students, capturing the daily rhythm of a place that had somehow become more than the sum of its parts. The producer, a woman named Rachel with sharp eyes and genuine curiosity, asked Michael during his interview, "What do you think Theodore Whitmore would say if he could see this place now?" Michael had thought about this question for 10 years. "I think he'd be surprised. Maybe disappointed that it's not the grain storage he built. But I hope he'd recognize that we're trying to do what he did, create something that serves people, that teaches skills, that builds community. Just in a different form." "Do you ever feel like you're living in his shadow?" Rachel asked. "No," Michael said honestly. "I feel like we're living in his light. There's a difference." The documentary aired in July, bringing renewed attention to the Whitmore workshops. Inquiries came from other rural communities wanting to know how to revitalize abandoned agricultural buildings. Foundations reached out offering grants for the Learning Center. A philanthropist in Omaha donated $75,000 specifically for scholarships. Michael handled the attention with the same quiet competence he'd applied to everything else, accepting help that served the community while deflecting personal recognition. This wasn't about him. It was about what could happen when you honored the past while building toward the future. In August, on the 10th anniversary of purchasing the grain storage, the workshop community organized a celebration, not just for Michael, but for everyone who'd contributed to the complex's resurrection. They gathered at sunset in the main silo, transformed now into a community gathering space, its vast cylindrical interior no longer empty but filled with purpose. Emma gave a short speech, her voice steady as she talked about what the place had meant to her growing up. When we moved here, I was scared. Everything in my life felt broken. But my dad taught me that broken things could be fixed if you cared enough to do the work. This complex was broken. Our lives were broken. And somehow, through fixing one, we fixed the other. David spoke about Theodore Whitmore, about the complicated legacy of a man who'd built an empire and lost it through his children's failures, only to have it reborn through strangers who understood what he'd been trying to create. Pete, the metalworker who now taught welding at the Learning Center, talked about what it meant to have a place that valued skill and craftsmanship in a world that increasingly didn't. Michael didn't speak. He stood at the back, watching faces illuminated by the setting sun through the high windows, listening to stories about how the workshops had changed lives. A single father who'd learned carpentry and now supported his family making custom furniture. A veteran who'd found purpose teaching metalwork after struggling with civilian life. A girl from the first Learning Center class who'd been hired by a major architectural firm and sent money back to fund scholarships for future students. These were the real measures of success. Not the gold coins or the money in the bank, but the lives touched, the skills passed on, the community built from abandonment and desperation and one man's hidden wealth. As the sun set completely and someone lit strings of lights across the silo's interior, Michael slipped away to the climate-controlled chamber one last time. He stood before Theodore's photograph in the dim space, the old man's stern face familiar now, almost companionable after a decade of one-sided conversations. "We made it 10 years, Michael said quietly. Emma's grown, confident, building her own legacy. The complex is thriving. We're teaching kids the skills they need to build lives. I kept half your fortune and shared half with David. He used it to tell your story properly, to preserve what you built in ways that matter. I used it to create what you originally wanted, a place that serves people and builds community." He paused, feeling the weight of a decade compressed into this moment. "I don't know if that makes me worthy by your standards, but it's the best I could do with what you left behind." For the first time in 10 years, Michael felt like the conversation was complete. He'd spent a decade trying to prove himself to a dead man's judgment, trying to honor intentions written in bitter disappointment 90 years ago. But standing here now, he realized Theodore's approval didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Michael had made choices he could live with, built something his daughter could be proud of, honored the past while creating a future. That was enough. He turned to leave the chamber, then paused, looking back at the photograph one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "For hiding what you hid, for writing what you wrote, for caring enough about the future to create this whole elaborate test. We passed. Not the way you expected, but we passed." Outside, the celebration continued. Emma was laughing with Learning Center students, explaining something about sustainable architecture with animated gestures. David was deep in conversation with Pete about oral history preservation. The workshop spaces glowed with warm light, filled with people who'd found purpose and community in a complex that had been dead for 22 years before Michael bought it for $350. Michael stood in the doorway between the climate-controlled chamber and the living space, between past and present, between what had been lost and what had been found. The grain storage hummed around him with life and purpose, every corner holding stories of transformation and second chances. "The land will remain," Theodore had written. And he'd been right. The complex stood on Nebraska soil that had witnessed 150 years of human drama, births and deaths, success and failure, hope and disappointment. The land remembered all of it, held all of it, offered its blank slate to each new generation willing to work. Michael had been willing. Desperate, yes, but also willing. And in that willingness, he'd found not just survival, but meaning. Not just shelter, but home. Not just an inheritance, but a legacy he could shape with his own hands. The Nebraska night settled over Millbrook, vast and star-filled. Inside the Whitmore workshops, people continued celebrating a decade of transformation. Outside, the land held its eternal witness, patient and enduring as it had always been. And in a climate-controlled chamber at the complex's heart, Theodore Whitmore's photograph watched over the space he'd designed to hide his wealth, the wealth that had accidentally saved Michael Torres and given purpose to everyone who'd found their way to this unlikely place.